Our first keynote this morning comes from Matt Brett, who is Senior Manager of Higher Education Policy at La Trobe University. Matt's also involved in a range of disability and equity-related projects. He co-edited Student Equity in Australian Higher Education, 25 Years of a Fair Chance, and prepared the chapter that reviewed disability in Australian higher education since 1990. He's recently published The Role of Inherent Requirement Statements in Australian Universities, which was the first national audit of inherent requirement statements. In 2008, he was awarded an Australian Learning and Teaching Council citation for his work in disability services and the development of live remote captioning services. Today, he speaks to us about 25 years of a fair chance for all, celebrating progress amid unfinished business. Welcome, Matt.
It's great to be here today. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which you meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. So it's really hard to follow that. And I think the thing that sort of speaks to me... I can. Is that better?
That's better.
Excellent. One of the things that speaks to me from what we've just heard is just the kind of rich history we have around disability in higher education over the last few decades. And my presentation, unfortunately, is not going to be able to cover that in the same kind of rich, uplifting kind of detail. So, and I'm also sort of conscious about time, so I'm going to whip through this as quick as I can and hopefully still have a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to start off by just putting two numbers on screen. I'm not sure if anyone can tell me what these two numbers represent. Any takers? One's 101,600, the other one's 60,019. Any takers? So the bottom number, 60,000, this is the official statistic that drives higher education policy and what we know about disability in Australian higher education. I think David Finton yesterday quoted a number of about 57,000, but that's universities only and not all higher education providers. So 60,000, that's the number of students we have in higher education today. We would all acknowledge that this is an imperfect kind of representation of disability in higher education. The number on top, 100,000, give or take, is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics survey of disability, ageing and carers. So this is probably the most sophisticated number and an accurate sort of assessment of disability that we have in Australian higher education. 100,000, this is a big number. This is a major discrepancy and a major kind of driver in terms of the decision making of government and policymakers around disability. So the fact that we're all focused on the 60,000 and not the 100,000, I think is kind of, to my mind, an interesting development. And what I want to speak to today is why that 60,000 number, where does it come from? Why does it exert so much power? And how we might sort of look forward to changing things in the future. Now this 60,000 number has its origins in a fair chance for all. So I've got up on screen a picture of the original glossy pack that was sent around to universities of fair chance for all, and speaking to someone last night, they've still got it in their office and they were thinking about bringing it along today. They were encouraged by their manager to throw it out just recently, but they have decided to hang on to it. It's a kind of landmark, game-changing sort of document and policy in Australian higher education, and myself and some co-authors did a bit of a reflection on this kind of document published this year. I encourage you all to sort of go out and read a copy. Don't buy it. It's one of those academic texts that costs way too much money, but you can access it for free at your library. So please do that. It'll give a more kind of detailed account of what's happened in the last 25 years, perhaps in a kind of dry policy sense and not the same kind of uplifting rich story we've had from Judy and Jenny today, but it's well worth a read. And I think it's worth reflecting when we've got a revolving door of Prime Ministers and an even faster revolving door of Education Ministers and a policy shelf life that is in the minutes sometimes rather than years. We've got a policy framework that's lasted for 25 years. It's really quite something. So it exerts a lot of power on Australian higher education. I'm just going to talk very briefly about what it entails and then discuss some of the implications of it. So the objective for a fair chance for all was to ensure that Australians from all groups have the opportunity to participate successfully in higher education, and it would be achieved by changing the balance of the student population to reflect more closely the composition of society as a whole. So it's all about participation, and just briefly, I'll say that the context of this is also in the sort of economic reforms that Australia had in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. So the walls of protectionism were sort of coming down, and industries were closing, a lot of displaced workers, and the government was really keen on maintaining a sort of a welfare safety net, of which education was a critical component and fairness was a critical component. So we needed a kind of a better framework for being able to do that, and a fair chance for all was the mechanism to be able to do that for higher education. So a fair chance for all sort of pretty long document in some ways, it's got 80 pages or something like that, and it specified for the first time the priority groups in education for Australian universities. And from what Jenny said before, at the time, disability was quite marginalised. There's a lot of activity. It wasn't as if disability was kind of off the radar, but for the first time, government had sort of acknowledged disability was a sort of key group, as well as other groups as well, kind of regional, OCS, etc. It set targets, absolute targets for increasing participation. It articulated the strategies for how that would be achieved. It led to the development of an indicator framework, and it required all universities to develop equity plans. And it still influences policy to this day. When we look at what it said around people with disabilities, not students with disabilities, the sort of semantics of that I think are important. It was to, in broad terms, increase the participation of people with disabilities in higher education, and it set targets, to double commencements from 1990 to 95. But I think also, again, quite importantly, it set a different target for vocational and professional courses. So from the outset of a fair chance for all, the sort of framework that guides Australian higher education, there was a sort of lower aspiration or lower expectation around employment for people with disabilities. You could do a sort of course, a general arts course, but if you want to be a doctor or an architect or something like that, maybe you don't belong. And I think whilst the implications or the significance of that can be overstated, we see in the labour market data that's an issue that's sort of still very valid and current today. In terms of setting a target for students with disabilities, I think at the time it's important to recognise that there was no way of actually being able to measure how many students we had in the sector. So how could you measure whether or not we were doubling participation in the sector? So one of the first things that needed to happen was to set up a way of being able to capture that. And as a result of being able to capture that information, which we do now, we can say with absolute confidence that every year since data has been collected, that the absolute numbers of students have increased and the proportional numbers of students with disabilities has increased. You can't say that for any other equity group. You can only say that for students with disabilities. It's a remarkable achievement in some ways, and the legacy of Jenny and Judy and so many people in the room of what's sort of underpinned this sort of growth in student participation. It's really quite an amazing story. But before we get too self-congratulatory, let's kind of delve down a little bit more deeper into the kind of metric and what it kind of means. And the way in which we measure this is through the enrolment declaration. Do you have a disability? Please indicate the area of impairment. Would you like to receive advice on support services? And I think there's a backstory to this, which I think is really, again, quite illustrative. At the time, in the consultation around what indicators we would have, Lynn Martin, who is now the TECSA Commissioner, who is responsible for setting this up, writes in the chapter of the book on her reflections of setting up the indicator framework that the Vice-Chancellors were against having an indicator for disability. Having an indicator for disability was only passed by a narrow majority of the committee that was trying to oversee this kind of project. So just think about what would happen if we did not have disability as a group, if we did not measure or collect information about students with disabilities, how different things would be. It sort of speaks to the attitudes around disability then and perhaps even now to this day. Even with the question, if one looks at the report from that project, there was a lot of consenting views on how we should pose the question. Should we talk about functional limitations or impairment or disability or some other way of describing things? And as a compromise, these questions were agreed to as a 3-year trial. And here we are, 25 years later, this 3-year trial is seemingly kind of permanent. And we would all agree, I think, that there are significant flaws with this question and significant flaws that sort of ripple through the way in which disability is treated within Australian higher education. Just delving down into what a fair chance for all suggested should be done around improving or doubling that participation rate for students with disabilities. It came up with a kind of range of strategies, and I think a couple of things can be said around that. Firstly is if one compares this list to the list of recommendations that were put forward yesterday by the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, there's a lot of similarity. In 25 years, how far have we moved things? You know, have we been able to grapple with and really resolve and make progress on some really fundamental issues to the participation of students with disabilities in Australian higher education? The other is just at a time when the maturity of the sector around disability in higher education was probably weak, they did a really good job, I think. The people that were involved in this framework really gave it a good shake. They came up with a good sense of what the barriers were and what might need to be done to address the needs of students with disabilities. I'll just very quickly go through some of the things in the list and make a few comments about these. So first off, special equipment and facilities. At the time, universities certainly played a role, and again, in conversation last night, some universities were spending upwards of $20,000 on Kurzweil scanners and that kind of thing. These days, technology has kind of improved in so many ways. There's probably more computing power in everyone's smartphone than there is in one of those $20,000, $30,000 pieces of equipment. NDIS is a bit of a game changer now. So the kind of role between what universities should be doing and what the rest of the sector should be doing is kind of changing and evolving in some ways. The advisors to help students with disabilities, well, that's us. And again, thanks to Jen and Judy and so many other people in the room for providing so ably the kind of supports that students need in providing that advice and support. Judy sort of alluded to the challenges of TEDCA and the transition to attend, and I just want to sort of give a nod of appreciation to Darlene and what she's been doing over recent years with attend. She's been doing a fantastic job. But for Judy, TEDCA was an incorporated body with the corporate reporting requirements of the BHP Bulletin, and how she managed to get the sector out of that and avoiding jail for the directors and corporate fines for non-compliance, and transitioning us to a much more sensible state of affairs, I think is a fantastic achievement. So hats off to Judy for that, as well as everything else that she's done over the years. The next two dot points around modifying materials and curriculum and flexible timetabling and course requirements, I think this is really where the rubber hits the road for higher ed, and I think we'll hear later on today about inherent requirements and many other things. We've still yet to grapple with the fundamental kind of issues around how inclusive is the curriculum, how do we modify what can be modified. And at the time, I think it's worthwhile to recognise that higher education at the time of the Fair Chance for All was a very small sector. The number of students with disabilities was quite small as well. And we are now in a mass, almost universal participation system where we have over 1.1 million students. Most universities will have tens of thousands of students enrolled. This is a kind of mass system that prioritises efficiency and standardisation. So how do we get the kind of bespoke kind of flexibility and modification of course requirements, etc., in that mass system? It's a continuing challenge. Just moving forward to what some of the gaps might be with a Fair Chance for All. One is which groups were prioritised and which ones were not, and mental health conditions is one group that's kind of not in that kind of named list, and it's certainly a big area of disability in higher education. And I just want to do some shameless kind of promotion here for a project that's come out of the University of Melbourne just in recent times. The website's supposed to be launched today, but may well be launched in a couple of days' time. But it's in my time in working in the sector, this is probably one of the best projects I've been involved with, and it provides resources for academics about how they can design their curriculum to be much more inclusive and to really cultivate wellbeing. I encourage you to take a look at it in due course. And these slides I think will be available, so don't be trying to write down the website sort of too quickly. Another area of weakness with the Fair Chance for All was the focus on participation, and if one considers the overall objective of the Fair Chance for All and the objective for students with disabilities, the focus on participation is almost assuming that if you get a degree, if you can get through higher education, it's going to be enough, you're going to succeed in life. But the data just says that's not true. From the ABS survey again of disability ageing and carers, if you've got a degree and a bachelor's degree, your chances of being employed are 50%, 1 in 2. If you do not have a disability and you have a bachelor's degree, 85% of people are employed. This is a kind of massive kind of difference, and I think it's to Australia's shame that we have that kind of difference, and we certainly need to turn our attention, I think, towards a stronger focus on outcomes. And outcomes is more than employment. There's all sorts of benefits from higher education that are quite important in my view. But as an indicator, focus on participation rather than employment, I think, is to the detriment of the participation of students with disabilities and the kind of benefits they can get out of higher education. Just going to, again, return to the stats that I opened up this presentation with the 60,000 disclosures and the 100,000 ABS. Whilst there's been some really good work in recent times, the University of Tasmania put out a really good kind of analysis, kind of more nuanced analysis of the success of retention of students with disabilities, using that sort of indicator and the kind of data that we have at our disposal. It doesn't really tell us that much around the quality of experience and the extent of discrimination in higher education. The ABS data does, though, and of those 100,000 students that are enrolled in universities, 16% reported that they had experienced discrimination in the last 12 months. 16%, that's about 16,000 students. And if one thinks about what the objectives are for the Disability Discrimination Act to eliminate discrimination, we're a long, long way away from that objective. And further to that, of those 16,000, give or take, who experienced discrimination, 23% said the source of discrimination was from their lecturer or teacher. So not only are we not eliminating discrimination, but we are a primary cause of discrimination for students with disabilities. This is a very troubling statistic from my perspective. And just to put that in context, you are far more likely to be discriminated against if you're a student with a disability by your lecturer than by a bus driver or a restaurant worker or any other occupation. So the enlightened, educated population in universities are more likely to discriminate than those that are perhaps having a lower level of education or lower level of skill. This again is a very troubling statistic. And I just want to make one comment about the ABS data. I don't have any mystical powers that sort of enable me to tap into this data. Every university in the country has access to this data. You just need to be able to log into the ABS website and you've got access to this and many other questions. The survey instrument that generates this runs to 500 pages and has dozens and dozens and dozens of questions that allow you to slice and dice the experience of students with disabilities in various ways. Can I maybe just get a show of hands as to people that are sort of currently accessing or using the ABS data of that? So some, it's quite pleasing to see that some are using it. Lots of people not, and I encourage people to think about how you might be able to use that as a way of being able to advocate for students with disabilities in your institution rather than your institutional data, which has got so many imperfections. The only other caveat I need to put forward with this is that with the ABS data, once you start getting down to the small numbers, there is a higher level of standard error with the data. So you just need to treat it with a degree of caution. But the trend that is there is indisputable. By far and above, teachers and lecturers are the highest source of discrimination for university students. And just to, again, kind of reinforce the point that measurement really matters in this space, if one thinks back to David Finton's presentation yesterday and the discussion around changes to the disability support program, the funds will be distributed by the number of students with disabilities in the sector. And we see from the two lines on the chart there, the red line is the funding for disability support program and the blue line is the number of students in the sector. The growth rate of students far exceeds the growth rate in the funding. And what that ostensibly means is that the dollar per student, if you were to run that formula backwards, drops from $200 per student to $118 per student over a 10-year period. And on current trend lines, we'll probably see that fall even further, maybe down to $75 per student in a few years' time. I think that there are some principal issues associated with the reform, which I think we should be supportive of, but I think absolutely we need to be advocating much more strongly with the department around the case for more funding. And part of the case we need to make is that there are 100,000 students in the sector that we're supporting, not 60,000. That provides a much stronger, compelling sort of evidence base for the kind of advocacy that you're all involved with. The other thing that I would say in relation to the Disability Support Program is that with only 20 submissions that have been made in consultation, I would encourage every one of you to go back to your office on Monday and put forward your views to the department. Make the case for more money. Make the case that there are 100,000 students in the sector and the piddly kind of amount of money that they make available is just insufficient. I'm going to close it here, and again, this is a very kind of quick overview of what's happened in 25 years. We've heard from Jenny and Judy's experiences that this is a kind of much richer story. I can't sort of do justice to that in my presentation, but I just want to make a few final comments. Firstly, fair chance for all has exerted significant influence in the sector. It's a very powerful policy framework that's still driving the sector to this day. But it's had its time, 25 years. We need to come up with something new. In terms of what I'll be doing about that, I've just taken up an equity fellowship with the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. And my job next year is to try and push that along, to try and come up with a new framework. And if anyone's interested in working with me or supporting me in that, please reach out to me. I'm hoping to consult with as many people as possible in that fairly ambitious task. The next thing I say is we just need better data. We can't rely on this half-baked enrolment, this declaration, this 3-year trial, with an imperfect sort of data collection. We need much better data. We can't look to government for all of the solutions to this. We should be working with each other, trying to find ways of trying to get the best data we can, trying to get a better picture of the experience of students with disabilities within our institutions, and trying to have better ways of being able to have a consistent story and narrative that we can share and discuss with each other. We also need a much stronger focus on outcomes. I think that employment stat needs to be a much more powerful driver of what we're doing, because to me it's an outrage. 1 and 2 graduates, they've been able to get through a degree, they can't get work. This is an outrage. Part of that is a labour market issue. We can't control the labour market, but we can't ignore this issue. We need to be doing something much more effective in this space. And on that note, I hope we still have some time for questions, and I'll throw it over to you. So thank you for your time and attention today. I enjoyed keeping tabs on the US presidential campaign, as many others I imagine did. And there was a documentary on Barack Obama in the lead up to the election where he spoke about the long arc of history, sort of bending very slowly, but always bending towards the kind of right side of history. And I think if we think about disability in higher education, things are bending in the right direction. They're bending the fact we have interpreters, the fact that we've got live captioning, the fact that we have this great sort of biennial conference. Things are heading in the right direction. We've got a long, long way to go though. I think that's the thing to keep in mind. We're way better than what we were, but we've got so much more to do and so much more to go. And the challenge is up to you. We've recognised 2 esteemed leaders in the sector over the last couple of decades, but there are many young people in the room, so the baton's over to you now. What are you going to do? How are you going to sort of change the world and make it a better place for students with disabilities?
Matt, just on that, if I could just ask you a question about those discrimination figures, which probably show to me that although there's been a huge amount of progress made in the sector over the last 25 years, maybe one of your issues is not translating that sufficiently widely to the broader academic sector. And is that perhaps one of the key areas of tension, that you've got your game together, but other people are not as across it as they could be in the broader sector?
I mean, in short answer to that is yes. I think one of the things about disability in higher education is it touches pretty much every part of the university. Whether it be your website, whether it be your promotions, your scholarships, your infrastructure, whatever it may be, it touches every element of that. And the practitioners are a sort of key part in being able to advocate for disability across the university, but it's everyone's responsibility. Every part of the university has a role to play. And the challenge in some ways is to find better ways of managing the service delivery and providing the adjustments, but allocating a sufficient amount of time and sufficient form of advocacy to the whole of institution about sort of making the changes that need to be made. And the academic community is critical to this. If the primary source of discrimination is from the teachers, this is an area of focus that needs to be prioritised.
That must be one of the reasons why there's that big disparity in the disclosure rates, mustn't it? Because where people are actually actively experiencing this, they're not seeing any particular benefit from disclosing, no matter how good the support is from the sector within the university.
Yeah, I think when it comes to disclosure, it's important to recognise that this is disclosure at enrolment, and people can acquire a disability at any point. As the point was made yesterday, this is a club you can join any time in your life. So it's never going to capture everyone's experience, and there is a whole lot of discrimination in every aspect of society. So people are legitimately fearful of stigma and will legitimately not make that disclosure at enrolment. What I would be hoping that we can move towards as a sector is a more robust, more effective way of being able to understand the experience of disability within higher education and not reliant on imperfect proxies like enrolment declarations or disability service registrations or whatever it may be. We need a nuanced way of being able to capture this experience that takes in all of these indicators.
Okay, look, I think we're fairly pressed for time, so we might thank Matt there very much indeed. Thank you, Matt. That's been terrific.